Greetings and welcome once again to LegalizeFreedom.com. I'm your host, Greg Moffitt, and today I'd like to present episode 14 of my TV and movie review series, Hauntology and Dystopia. Now, as usual, we'll be looking back, casting a retrospective eye over two cultural artifacts. This time out, it's two TV series from 1977. British TV series, maybe the right way up would be good. British TV series, King of the Castle, and then from 1983, a BBC TV series, another British production, or BBC Scotland actually, The Mad Death. Okay, so beginning with King of the Castle, this, as I say, from 1977. It was ostensibly a children's TV series, and as I've mentioned many times in my media coverage of these things, what we consider suitable for children back then in the 60s, 70s, and 80s is very different from what's considered suitable or appropriate for children today. On one level, children are not challenged by thought-provoking, existential and philosophical dimensions to shows like King of the Castle, for example. On the other hand, they are, degraded and poisoned, I would say, by some form or other of what I would call adult content, which is not appropriate for children. So it's been a very, very strange switch around in children's TV programming in the decades, certainly since I was a child, moved into adulthood. King of the Castle was originally slated for a children's TV slot, so late afternoon, after teenagers might get back from school. But it was reviewed by programmers and determined it was going to be a little bit too scary, perhaps, for children to watch on their own. So it was moved to a tea time slot. For those of you outside the UK, that's kind of like 5 p.m., between 5 and 6 p.m. The opportunity there being for children to watch with their parents or a parent. As you might have noticed from your brief glimpse of the DVD cover there, this is set in a tower block, a high-rise block of flats. In the 1970s, there were a lot of these things still being built, kind of began in the late 50s through to the 60s. And it was seen as the future of urban living, certainly for those who couldn't afford their own, independent dwelling. And I was drawn to it when I first read the synopsis of this series before I saw it. I was instantly drawn to it because of, well, frankly, it was J.G. Ballard's 1975 novel High Rise, which I read back in the 80s, which kind of really postulates a sort of logical devolution, an end game for high-rise living, where that might go. Now, in High-Rise, Ballard's novel, the high-rise block, which is much, much bigger than the one that appears in this series, is stratified. So the richer you are, the higher up in the block you live. But the whole thing descends into bloody chaos, and High-Rise is something that's been made into a movie. That's something I will be getting to in due course. Suffice to say, King of the Castle is set in a tower block, and our protagonist is a young man, young teenager, again, very much like the sort of people that the series was aimed at. And he's recently moved into this block with his father and his stepmother, and he's not having a good time. He's not having a good time at school, and he's not having a good time at home, and he's going through a lot of the things that teenagers go through. Complicated by all of this are the living circumstances in the tower block. He encounters in his way back home and out again bullies, sort of gang who also live in the flats, who've kind of established themselves, on the stairwells and near the lifts and things. Are kind of taking control. This is their little fiefdom. So yeah, and he's a sensitive soul. He's a choir boy, amongst other things, despite his working class roots. And basically, early on, the lift that he opts to take instead of using the stairs malfunctions, and it plunges down I can't remember if the cable snaps or not, but it plunges down into the basement, the lower levels below the tower block. And it is there that the show really begins. And he emerges into an underworld. And it's here that the series switches into uh, dark fantasy. He is knocked unconscious, and when he wakes up, he finds himself, as I say, in this fantasy underworld of magic, myth, and mystery. And the rest of the episodes in the series follow his journey through the realms, I guess somewhere beneath the city, underneath the his tower block, as he gradually, I say, goes through a journey on many different levels, and it eventually emerges physically and metaphorically from this underworld. And the characters he encounters in the underworld are like dreamlike versions of characters that were already established in the first episode. You know, people who feature in his life in some way. Um, his choir master, the caretaker of the tower block, local police, his stepmother, and they appear, as I say, in dreamlike versions, and it's very much like a hero's journey, you know, writ small. This is one man's journey from childhood to manhood through visions of archetypes in the series. There's allegory and symbolism everywhere. And it's obvious that when he's meeting these dreamlike versions of characters in his life, that this is performing a function. It is very dreamlike in the sense that I don't know how many of you have had this experience, but I've encountered alters, different versions of people in my life in dreams, not as I know them, but in some other form, performing some other function, uh, you know, within my own psyche. So that's kind of what you're seeing on the screen here. And if this all sounds very complex and potentially complicated for children, well, it is. It would be nowadays, but it wasn't seen as such back then. It was like this is perfectly acceptable fodder for tea time TV. Um, he encounters a warrior archetype. That's the bully on the stairs. A witch who tries to imprison him. That's his stepmother. And a mad scientist character is the choir master. And he undergoes a series of tests and challenges as he moves through the underworld, and each episode passes by. And it's a little bit like, again, I said hero's journey writ small. What you're seeing here is the same process that you see in Lord of the Rings or in the Star Wars cycle. It's the same mythic quest. And eventually our protagonist, the young boy, becomes king of the castle. And one of the realizations that he makes at that point is essentially that with great power comes great responsibility. A cliche, I know, but it's true. And he felt frustrated and powerless and bullied in his incarnation, you know, in the real world above, so to speak. But when he is given rule over this domain, then all these other complexities of power come in. And throughout the whole thing, there's a kind of a metaphor. And one of the characters, Vane, who seems to be his sort of guide through this underworld in some ways and keeps encouraging him to move on. He's a master of the keys. You know, there's many doors that our friend comes up against him, and Vane has the keys to each door. Are you ready for the next stage? And to go up, you want to go up, you know, again, back up to ground level, to go up. But to go up really, as I said, is a child becoming a man, facing your fears. Only then can you go up. Only then can you evolve and grow personally. And one thing that struck me about watching this is that, say, the castle, so-called, and there's sort of a gothic setting, you know, castle-like setting with rattling keys and iron gates and mazes and a labyrinth and whatnot in this underworld. It resonated with me on a level, on a dreamlike level, because this young man's making his way through this castle, these labyrinth, this maze of challenges, physical challenges, psychological challenges to go up. And in dream interpretation, I have many, many dreams set in houses. You might think, well, what's unusual about that? But the house itself has some kind of life and some kind of character. And in dream interpretation, the house is the dreamer's mind. So it really struck a chord with me on that level. Um, there's a stellar cast in this series of character actors and nobody famous, but if you've been watching British TV, if you're a fan of this retro stuff, you'll recognize some of them. Um, Telford Thomas plays Vane, and he's the caretaker of the block of flats up top. We saw him in Survivors, a series, an outstanding series, post-apocalyptic series, post-pandemic series, which I reviewed again as part of this series. You can, rewind and find my coverage of that. I was also in the Avengers and Doctor Who, two of my favorite series, and I'll be covering some of the content in both of those at some point. Fulton Mackay, another great actor of his era. He's best known as the prison warden in Ronnie Barker's comedy drama prison TV series Porridge, but he was also in The Saint and once again Doctor Who. Milton Johns, great character actor, such a memorable face and attitude about him. Again in Doctor Who, and he stars in a series called The Intruder, which I've just recently watched, and that's going to be part of an upcoming episode of Hauntology and Dystopia. And he also appears briefly in The Empire Strikes Back. See if you can spot him. He's amongst other things, he's in the scene where Han Solo is being frozen in carbonite. So I'll leave you eagle-eyed viewers to find him there. I would say that in terms of the coming of age and the teenage audience that King of the Castle was aimed at, it has commonality with other series such as Sky, Children of the Stones, Raven. These shows, if I haven't already covered them in Hauntology and Dystopia, I will be doing so in future. In the meantime, if you go back to my 2023 presentation at the Mysterious Earth conference, you'll find a video of that presentation on the channel on YouTube, Legalize Freedom 1, or you can also find a link at legalizefreedom.com. I do talk about all those series in the context of megaliths in the movie. So, so King of the Castle is unique, really. I've never really seen anything like it. And if I haven't, what I haven't said already, doesn't tempt you to watch it, then you're probably not going to. But it's an outstanding piece of period television. So turning to our second item for today, as mentioned, The Mad Death, actually filmed in 1981, but not released until 1983. It didn't screen until 1983. Don't know why. Don't think that has any particular relevance. Based on Nigel Slater's novel, The Mad Death, not the TV chef Nigel Slater. I assume it's not the TV chef. Maybe that's why he cooks so many vegetables after seeing this. But yes, okay. So as mentioned at the top of the show, it was a BBC Scotland production, and it is filmed mostly in Scotland. And as far as the cast of this one goes, it's there's a few notables, but probably mostly Richard Heffer is a very recognizable face from TV, late 70s and throughout the 80s. If you just Google his name and get some images, many of you, been around the block as many times as me, will recognize his face. As you might have guessed from the imagery on the book cover and the DVD cover, this is about a rabies outbreak in Britain. A contemporaneous set at the time, early 80s. Now, it's difficult for people who weren't around at the time, late 70s and early 80s, to grasp or imagine what a big issue rabies was in terms of like seen as an existential threat to the country. And there was a lot of public information and security at airports all around avoiding rabid animals or infection getting into the country mainly through the illegal importation of pets, which is, that was the main seen as the main risk. And indeed, that's how rabies finds its way into Britain in the Mad Death. Um, the public information films around this time are worthy of comment in themselves because that's almost a whole subgenre. There were so many of them where whether it was staying away from water as children are staying away from electricity substations, it seemed that the environment was just full of these threats. The play environment, where kids might go to play when they actually played outside, was awash with threats. And some of them were very, very sinister and creepy, and the ones around rabies, particularly so. And if you put this in the context of the time, it takes on a new kind of level of threat, of existential threat and dread, because the Cold War was kind of at its peak um, in the early 80s. At this time, you had the movie Threads, um, just one of the bleakest movies ever made, again, showing the outbreak of an aftermath of nuclear war in Britain, released the same year, 1983. And in the Mad Death itself, you have some really quite shocking imagery around the rabies outbreak. So, I mean, all in all, this is really well done series. I had heard of it, but I only watched it like a year or so ago. And I was really, really impressed with how well done it was. And it would have made an excellent feature film. That's still possible, I suppose. And uh, encephalitis, or brain inflammation, is what rabies causes, but the outward expression of that is all sorts of really disturbing behavior in infected humans, and rabies is almost always fatal. I think this is what the fear around it is so strong because there's just once you've got rabies, that's it, generally speaking. And the weird thing is that the symptoms can manifest after infection, anything from maybe a week to up to about a year later. So you could go travel somewhere in the world, less sanitized, get infected with rabies and just carry on with the rest of your life. And then suddenly out of nowhere, you've forgotten about your trip to deepest, darkest Africa. And then suddenly you're suffering from rabies. The hydrophobia, the so-called fear of water, is a kind of the headline thing with in people's imagination about how rabies victims act. Being offered water and they act like they're, I don't know, someone's sticking a gun in their face. And of course, often they have to be physically restrained in a hospital bed in order so that they're not a danger to themselves. Um, the opening titles in The Mad Death are very effective as well. It's kind of a really creepy version of All Things Bright and Beautiful, set over disturbing imagery of the rabid fox and water. And that really sets the tone for the rest of the series. I say series, it's a very, very mini series, just 3 episodes actually of it. And the build up to the outbreak and all the tension around that is excellent. And it really, from the first episode, I was absolutely hooked. I thought, oh my God, this is one of the best things of its kind that I've ever seen. And it's fast paced. There's a great blend of thoughtful interludes, but the action sequences are very, very well done. And I watched it in one sitting. I thought, well, I'll spread it over 3 nights. But no, I just watched the whole thing in one go. I was absolutely hooked. And um, there's a particularly good sequence, actually, which in a shopping mall, which has been menaced by a rabid dog. And that then got me thinking about all the zombie movies that were, had become popularized in the 70s and 80s by George Romero. And then now in the early 21st century are just practically dime a dozen. And all the metaphors that has for modern society and the pandemic period that we lived through. And I was reminded of 28 Days Later, that was kind of the modern reboot of Romero's work in some way, sort of a halfway house between just the classic zombie and actually then what we later lived through with COVID-19. And it was actually in Survivors, the series I mentioned a few minutes ago. I mentioned that again because there's an episode of Survivors where, as society breaks down due to a pandemic, wild dogs become a thing. Suddenly animals all start to go feral again. We don't have pets anymore. And there's one episode of Survivors that orientates around rabies and the consequences of what happens, as that infection begins to spread. So I was strongly reminded of that. Something then happens with the Mad Death, and it feels like it's missing a middle because just 3 episodes, and it's so unsettling and so disturbing in so many ways. And we get to reflect on, again, the pandemic period and think about civil liberties being restricted, forced vaccinations, all of that's ramping up and things are moving at a great pace. And then it kind of moves to a conclusion where everything's successfully resolved. And for me, it felt a little bit like, so what you essentially have is a happy ending, but I felt that it looked like if things were going to get really bad. And let's face it, as viewers, that's kind of what we want to see. You don't watch a zombie apocalypse movie wanting it to never really get off the ground and the authorities to take control and like, oh, well, as you were, nothing to see here. So it never really happened. So as well done as this is, I felt a little bit disappointed at the conclusion. I still heartily recommend it, but I wanted it to be a little bit more. I think that you could have made this a 6-part series, fleshed it out a little bit, kept people on a knife edge a little bit more, and then moved to the conclusion that they already had. But there's, again, I stated in the last episode when I was talking about uh, those shows, that parallels keep coming up between these past real or fictionalized episodes and what we've been living through in the early 21st century. And one of the things that's most strongly put forward in the Mad Death is this rural and urban divide and the rich and the rest of society type divide. And these are, whether it's like, persecution of farmers or whatever it happens to be, there are issues that tangentially flow from, the events in the Mad Death that remind us of issues that really, at one point we were told were no longer issues. There were no longer tensions in those areas, but there very much are, very much are. Now, the Mad Death is a bit of a lost treasure in the sense that it was only repeated once on television, and that was in 1985. And I've seen DVDs offered on sale. I looked just yesterday for as much as £80. That's like over $100. This one, as you see, the BBC one, I don't remember what I paid for that a couple of years ago, but it wasn't that much. It really wasn't. So yeah, the Mad Death we've been discussing today, thoroughly recommended. I think it could have been more than it really is, but well worth checking out. As mentioned, based on Nigel Slater's novel there. I've not actually read this yet, didn't get round to it, but as always with these things, I mentioned this before when I've showed either novels that TV or movies are based on or novelizations. Always interested to see how these differ or overlap with the finished film product or TV product. And our first item from today, once again, King of the Castle, network DVD. As you can see, network, about 2/3 of the things I've reviewed so far in this series have been on network. The company went into administration last year. So snap up their editions while you still can, because all of this stuff is going to be going out of print if it hasn't already. And it may or may not, this and others, may or may not be picked up for future re-release. Only hard media is real. Only physical media is real. So thank you for watching. Once again, I'm your host, Greg Moffitt, and you've been watching LegalizeFreedom.com.
LegalizeFreedom.com